The Exetheri Empire was feared across the galaxy. Their warriors were stronger, faster, and deadlier than any other species. They had conquered countless worlds, crushing all resistance with ease. At the heart of this empire sat Queen Vyrexia, a ruler as ruthless as she was powerful. For centuries, she had heard whispers of a strange species, humans. Some called them warriors, others called them survivors. But to Vyrexia, they were nothing more than a myth, a joke. How could a weak, primitive species like humans ever stand against the Exetheri? Their so-called victories were exaggerations, lies spread by desperate fools. She dismissed the stories without a second thought. But everything changed when she received an urgent report from her generals. "My queen, the humans are resisting our invasion on Kesar 4. Vyrexia narrowed her eyes. Kesar 4 was supposed to be an easy conquest, a planet rich in resources but poorly defended. Yet, somehow, the humans were holding the Exetheri forces back. She leaned forward on her throne. "Explain." The general hesitated before speaking. "They fight differently, my queen. They do not rely on brute strength, but on tactics. They set traps, use the terrain, and strike from the shadows. They are unpredictable." Vyrexia scoffed. "Unpredictable. That is just another word for weak. Crush them. End this embarrassment." The general bowed and left, but doubt lingered in the queen's mind. No species had ever stalled a Exetheri invasion before. Could the humans truly be as dangerous as the rumors claimed? No, it was impossible. Meanwhile, on Kesar 4, the planet's rugged terrain was a perfect battleground for Commander Darius Hale and his forces. The Exetheri were strong, but they relied on overwhelming force and direct attacks. That was their weakness. Darius stood atop a rocky hill, scanning the battlefield below. The Exetheri soldiers marched in tight formations, their armor gleaming under the twin suns. A normal army would have fled or surrendered, but humans were different. He activated his radio. "Team Alpha, prepare the charges. Beta Squad, lure them in. Charlie, wait for my signal." The Exetheri advanced, unaware of the hidden traps and explosives placed along the path. Just as they entered the perfect position, Darius smirked. Now, explosions erupted, tearing through the enemy ranks. Smoke and fire filled the air. The Exetheri panicked as hidden snipers and ambush teams struck from all sides. Within minutes, an entire battalion was in chaos. Darius watched, satisfied. The queen thought humans were weak. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. And when she did, it would change everything. The Exetheri Empire had never known defeat. Their warriors were strong, their technology superior, and their conquests unstoppable. But on Kesar 4, something was wrong. Queen Vyrexia received another report. Her generals stood before her, their heads lowered. She could smell fear in the air. "Speak," she commanded. One of the generals hesitated before answering. "The humans. They fight like no enemy we have faced before. They do not attack us directly. They set traps, use deception, and strike from the shadows." Vyrexia's eyes narrowed. "You are telling me that a few weak creatures are defeating the greatest warriors in the galaxy." The general swallowed hard. "They are not weak, my queen. They are different." Vyrexia clenched her fists. She had ruled for centuries. She had seen species rise and fall. She had crushed rebellions and burned worlds. And now, these primitive humans dared to challenge her empire. She would end this herself. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Commander Darius Hale moved like a ghost through the rocky terrain. His soldiers followed silently. The Exetheri were powerful, but they had one weakness. They thought they were invincible. Darius knew better. His team had studied the Exetheri. They learned how they moved, how they attacked, and most importantly, how they thought. The Exetheri expected a battle of strength. But humans? Humans fought with strategy. Darius signaled to his squad, "Get ready. They're coming." The ground trembled as Exetheri patrol approached. Tall, armored, and overconfident, they marched straight into the humans' trap. Darius waited. He could see the arrogance in their steps. They thought they were the hunters. But tonight, they were the prey. At the perfect moment, he whispered into his radio. Now. Explosions erupted. Smoke filled the air. Hidden gunmen fired from the cliffs. The Exetheri roared in anger, but they couldn't see their enemy. Darius leaped down, moving faster than they expected. His knife flashed, cutting through the armor of Exetheri soldier before he even had time to react. Panic spread through the enemy ranks. They were stronger, but they didn't know how to fight an enemy they couldn't see. Within minutes, the battle was over. Darius looked at the fallen Exetheri. They think we're just stories, he muttered. Let's show them how real we are. As the humans disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but fear and confusion, one thing was certain. The Exetheri Empire was no longer the hunters, and Queen Vyrexia was about to meet the nightmare she never believed existed. Queen Vyrexia stood on the bridge of her warship, staring at the battle reports on the holographic display. The news was impossible. The Exetheri had never faced an enemy like this before. For the first time in centuries, her army was struggling. The Exetheri warriors were powerful, trained for war from birth, their bodies naturally stronger and faster than most species. But these humans fought differently. They refused to engage in direct combat, instead attacking from the shadows, setting traps, and disappearing like ghosts. It was frustrating. It was humiliating. Vyrexia clenched her claws into a fist. She turned to her top general. Tell me the truth. How many warriors have we lost? The general hesitated. His voice was lower than usual. Over 3,000, my queen. A cold silence filled the room. Vyrexia's tail flicked in irritation. You are telling me that a small group of humans has killed thousands of Exetheri warriors. The general lowered his head. Yes, my queen. Her crimson eyes burned with rage. Unacceptable. Meanwhile, on Kesar 4, Darius Hale knelt beside a ridge, his binoculars focused on the Exetheri war camp. Even from a distance, he could see chaos. The once proud alien soldiers moved with hesitation. Their usual discipline was shaken. Some stood guard, their weapons trembling slightly in their hands. Others whispered among themselves. They were afraid. Darius smirked. They're not invincible after all. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Marks, crouched beside him. They don't know what to do next. Darius nodded. That was the power of humans, not brute strength, but adaptability. The Exetheri fought in patterns, predictable and structured. Humans. They changed tactics every time the enemy tried to adjust. He turned to his squad. We push them one more time. They'll break. The breaking point. That night, the humans struck again. Explosives tore through the Exetheri supply lines. Snipers took out high-ranking officers. Every time the Exetheri tried to fight back, the humans were already gone, leaving behind only fear and destruction. By dawn, the Exetheri couldn't take it anymore. Vyrexia received the message aboard her warship. My queen, we must retreat. She slammed her fist against the metal throne. Never. But deep down, she knew the truth. If they stayed, more of her warriors would die. Her eyes burned with fury, but she had no choice. With a heavy heart, she gave the order. Pull back our forces. As the Exetheri ships rose into the sky, leaving Kesar 4 behind, one thought echoed in Vyrexia's mind. Who are these humans, and how have they beaten me? For the first time, the queen of the mighty Exetheri Empire had been forced to retreat, and she would never forget it. The Exetheri fleet hung in orbit above Kesar 4, their massive warships blocking out the sun. The queen's forces had retreated from the battlefield, but the war was not over. Queen Vyrexia sat in her throne room, staring at the battle reports. The word retreat echoed in her mind like an unbearable wound. No species had ever forced her to pull back. No species had ever humiliated the Setheri Empire. And yet here she was, licking her wounds while primitive humans celebrated their so-called victory. Her claws dug into the metal of her throne. "I will not allow this to stand." A voice interrupted her thoughts. "My queen, a message from the human commander." Vyrexia narrowed her eyes. A message? The Setheri officer nodded and played the transmission. A hologram flickered to life, revealing Commander Darius Hale. He stood tall, battle-worn but confident. His dark eyes held none of the fear she had seen in other species. Instead, there was something else. Challenge. Darius smirked. "Queen Vyrexia, I know you're watching. You thought humans were weak. You thought we were nothing but stories. But now, you've seen the truth." Vyrexia's tail twitched, her fists clenching. "Your warriors fight with strength. Mine fight with intelligence. Yours follow orders. Mine adapt. You think you've seen everything we can do." He leaned closer to the camera. "You haven't seen anything yet." Vyrexia growled. "This human is arrogant." But the message wasn't over. "I challenge you, Queen Vyrexia. A duel. You and me, one-on-one. If you win, we surrender. If I win, you leave Kesar 4 for good." The room fell silent. The Setheri general stared in disbelief. A human, a mere mortal, was challenging their queen to single combat. One general spoke carefully. "My queen, it's beneath you. You don't have to accept." Vyrexia's claws tapped against her throne. She could order another invasion. She could wipe out the humans by sending her full fleet. But that wasn't what she wanted. No, she wanted to crush this human herself. She wanted to see the fear in his eyes when he realized he had challenged a goddess of war. Her lips curled into a smirk. "Prepare my armor." Her generals gasped, but she raised a hand to silence them. "I will accept this challenge. I will make this human kneel." As the transmission ended, Vyrexia's heart burned with anticipation. The duel was set, and soon Darius Hale would learn what it meant to challenge a queen. The twin suns of Kesar 4 burned overhead, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. Every soldier, human and Setheri alike, stood at a distance, watching. This was no ordinary fight. This was a duel that would decide the fate of the war. On one side stood Commander Darius Hale, dressed in reinforced combat armor, a blade strapped to his back, a pistol at his hip. His breath was steady. His eyes were locked on the figure across from him. On the other side stood Queen Vyrexia. She was taller, stronger, and faster than any Setheri warrior. Her battle armor shimmered in deep crimson, her claws razor-sharp, her golden eyes burning with fury and anticipation. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Vyrexia smirked. "I expected you to run, human." Darius chuckled. "And I expected you to be taller." The Setheri warriors growled at the insult, but Vyrexia only grinned. "Amusing. I will enjoy breaking you." She moved first, fast as lightning. Darius barely had time to react as she lunged, claws slicing through the air. He dodged, rolling to the side as her strike tore through solid rock like paper. She was faster than he expected. But speed wasn't everything. Darius countered, drawing his blade in a swift motion, slashing toward her exposed side. Vyrexia twisted her body, catching the blade with her armored gauntlet. Sparks flew. She laughed. "You fight well, for a lesser creature." Darius smirked. "And you talk too much." He dropped low, sweeping her legs out from under her. But Vyrexia was no ordinary warrior. She jumped, flipping midair and landing gracefully. The crowd of warriors watched in stunned silence. No human had ever fought a Setheri queen like this. Darius exhaled. This wasn't going to be easy. The battle intensifies. Vyrexia launched another attack. Unrelenting, brutal, precise. Each strike was meant to kill, but Darius wasn't just dodging. He was learning. He saw patterns in her movements, small openings in her defense. And then he exploited them. He feinted left, then struck right, landing a solid hit across her side. Her armor absorbed most of the impact, but she felt it. For the first time, Vyrexia staggered. She wiped a drop of blue blood from her lip and smiled. "Impressive, human. I almost respect you." Darius twirled his blade. "Almost." Vyrexia's grin widened. "Let's see if you survive the next round." They charged at each other again, two warriors from different worlds, locked in a battle that neither could afford to lose. The real fight had just begun. Darius Hale moved like a shadow, dodging Queen Vyrexia's deadly claws by mere inches. She was fast, faster than any opponent he had ever faced. Every strike she made carried raw power, capable of shattering bones. But she was predictable. Darius had fought enemies bigger, stronger, faster than him before. They all made the same mistake. They'd underestimated him. Vyrexia lashed out with a powerful swipe. Instead of retreating, Darius stepped forward, ducking under her arm and slamming his elbow into her ribs. The impact was solid, making the queen stumble back. A murmur rippled through the HFY warriors watching. Their queen, the greatest fighter in the Empire, had been hit by a human. Vyrexia straightened, her golden eyes narrowing. "You are full of surprises." Darius smirked. "You have no idea." Without warning, he threw a handful of sand into the air. Vyrexia growled, momentarily blinded. Darius used the opening to land a solid kick to her knee, forcing her down. He followed up with a punch to her jaw, his enhanced combat gloves adding extra force. For the first time in centuries, Queen Vyrexia felt pain. The HFY warriors gasped. Their queen had never been struck like this in single combat. Vyrexia wiped blood from her lip and grinned. "You fight dirty." Darius shrugged. "I fight to win." The tide turns. The queen roared, her patience gone. She charged with relentless fury, her speed increasing. Darius barely had time to react as she slammed into him, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his ribs. Before he could rise, Vyrexia grabbed him by the collar and lifted him off the ground like he weighed nothing. "You are strong, human," she said, eyes gleaming. "But I am stronger." She threw him, his body slamming into a rock. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. Darius coughed, forcing himself to his feet. His vision blurred for a moment, but he shook it off. Vyrexia approached slowly. "You challenged me, human. You should have known how this would end." Darius wiped blood from his chin and smiled. "Still standing, aren't I?" The queen stopped. His words, his determination, struck something inside her. Any other opponent would be begging for mercy by now. But this human, he refused to surrender. Vyrexia suddenly felt something she had not felt in a long time. Respect. Darius clenched his fists, ready for the next round. But for the first time, Vyrexia hesitated. And in that hesitation, the balance of the fight shifted. The battle wasn't over yet. The air was thick with tension as Darius Hale and Queen Vyrexia circled each other. Both were breathing heavily now, their movements slower but no less deliberate. Every soldier watching, human and HFY alike, knew the battle was reaching its peak. Darius wiped sweat from his brow, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his blade. His ribs ached from the earlier blow, and he could feel the sting of a gash on his arm. Still, he forced himself to stand tall. Vyrexia's golden eyes locked onto him. Her once pristine armor was dented and scorched. A small streak of blue blood ran down her side, a mark she never thought a human could inflict. "You surprise me, human," she said, her voice low but steady. "Few have ever pushed me this far." Darius smirked. "You're welcome." The queen's lip curled into a faint grin, but the amusement didn't last long. She lunged again, her claws slashing the air. Darius sidestepped, countering with a swift jab to her side. She hissed in pain but kept coming. The clash of their weapons echoed through the rocky terrain. Steel met claws, brute strength met cunning. Darius knew he couldn't match her power, but he could still outthink her. Vyrexia swung wide, and Darius ducked, rolling under her arm and landing behind her. He slashed upward, his blade grazing her shoulder. The queen staggered but quickly turned, lashing out with a kick that caught him in the chest. Darius hit the ground hard, coughing as the wind was knocked out of him. "You're relentless," he muttered, pushing himself up. "You don't know the meaning of the word," Vyrexia shot back. A moment of doubt. As the duel continued, both combatants showed signs of wear. Vyrexia's strikes were a fraction slower, and Darius's movements were more calculated, conserving what little energy he had left. For the first time in centuries, Queen Vyrexia began to feel something she hadn't felt in battle before: doubt. How was it possible for a human, a species she had dismissed as weak, as irrelevant, to last this long against her? She was the strongest, the fastest, the best the Exetheri had to offer. And yet this mortal continued to stand his ground. Darius, on the other hand, was running out of time. He knew he couldn't keep this up much longer, but he also knew that if he faltered now, everything he had fought for, his people, his home, his planet, would be lost. He gritted his teeth and lunged, surprising Vyrexia with a feint. Her claws swiped at empty air, and Darius drove his blade forward, grazing her armor again. The queen growled, but Darius noticed something in her eyes. "She's tired." For the first time, victory didn't seem so impossible. The rocky battlefield was silent except for the ragged breathing of the two warriors. Darius Hale and Queen Vyrexia stood just a few feet apart, neither willing to retreat. The once mighty Exetheri soldiers and the human resistance fighters watched from a distance, their usual hostility replaced by awe. Vyrexia's armor bore deep scratches and scorch marks. Blue blood trickled from a wound on her side, though she stood tall, refusing to show weakness. Darius was no better off. His combat suit was torn, his left arm hung awkwardly at his side, and sweat dripped down his face. But despite the pain, he kept his blade steady. "You fight like no other," Vyrexia said at last. Her voice was calm, almost reflective. Darius forced a smile. "You're not too bad yourself." The queen's lips curled into the faintest of grins. For the first time in this long, grueling battle, she allowed herself a moment to think. Every opponent she had faced in her long reign had fought with one goal: to overwhelm her with strength. They always lost. But this human, he didn't rely on brute force. He adapted. He learned. He kept coming even when others would have collapsed. He wasn't fighting for glory or power. He was fighting for his people, for survival. And that made him dangerous. The shift in balance. Darius, meanwhile, couldn't help but notice the change in her tone. She wasn't taunting him anymore. She wasn't boasting about her strength or ridiculing his weakness. Instead, she sounded impressed. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his blade. "So, what happens now?" he asked, cautiously circling her. "You going to finish me off, or are you finally starting to think we're more than just a myth?" Vyrexia tilted her head, her golden eyes studying him. "Perhaps there's more truth to the stories than I once believed." For a moment, it felt as though the entire battlefield was holding its breath. Then the queen did something no one expected. She lowered her claws. Darius froze, unsure if it was a trick. But Vyrexia's expression was unreadable. She straightened, towering over him, her wounds ignored. "You have proven your worth, human," she said. "Today, you stand as more than just a mortal. You stand as my equal." The human fighters gasped. The Exetheri warriors murmured in disbelief. Their queen, the unchallenged ruler of a galactic empire, had just admitted equality with a human. Darius stared at her, unsure of what to say. Slowly, he lowered his blade. The tension broke. Both armies relaxed, their weapons falling to their sides. The duel was over. And though there was no handshake, no official truce, something unspoken passed between Darius and Vyrexia. a respect neither of them could have imagined at the start. Back aboard her flagship, Queen Vyrexia stood alone in the observation chamber. The vast expanse of the galaxy stretched out before her, the stars cold and indifferent. Behind her lay the battlefield she had left, a world where humans had stood their ground and forced the mighty Xetheri Empire to withdraw. Her claws rested lightly on the railing, the blue blood that had dried on them now washed clean. Yet the marks of the battle were still fresh in her mind. She had underestimated the humans, this strange species that fought with a mix of cunning, grit, and heart. For centuries, the Xetheri had viewed themselves as invincible, their empire unshakable. But now, Phyrexia knew that the galaxy was changing. The old ways, conquer and crush, dominate and destroy, were no longer enough. The humans had proved that. A new perspective. Her thoughts returned to Commander Darius Hale, the human warrior who had defied all expectations. In their duel, she had felt his strength, not just in his blows, but in his spirit. He fought not for glory or power, but for his people's survival. That drive, that unyielding will, was something that Xetheri had never truly faced before. It was also something she had come to admire. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. The door to the observation chamber slid open, and her chief advisor entered, his silver scales catching the light. He hesitated before speaking. "My queen, the generals await your orders. They wish to know how we will retaliate." Vyrexia turned her head slightly, her golden eyes piercing. "Retaliate?" The advisor nodded. "Yes, the humans have humiliated us. The soldiers are restless. They want revenge." Vyrexia looked back at the stars. "Revenge? No." The advisor blinked, clearly caught off guard. "My queen." She turned fully now, her presence commanding. "We have underestimated them once. To make the same mistake again would be foolish. If we strike without understanding, we risk exposing further weaknesses." Her voice softened, though her tone remained firm. "The humans are not just another foe. They are a reminder that strength alone is not enough. We must learn, adapt." The advisor stared at her, stunned. The queen, who had always ruled through sheer might, was now speaking of change. "Inform the generals that our forces will regroup and stand down for now. We will observe the humans more closely, learn their ways. Only then will we decide our next course." Though hesitant, the advisor nodded and left the chamber. A quiet shift. Vyrexia returned her gaze to the stars. In the silence, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. Perhaps the humans were more than just a temporary obstacle. Perhaps they were the key to a new era. For the first time in her long reign, Queen Vyrexia felt something unexpected. A flicker of hope that her empire might grow stronger through understanding, rather than destruction. In the days following the duel, a fragile quiet settled over Kesar IV. The Xetheri forces had withdrawn, leaving behind the wreckage of a battle that no one, human or alien, could forget. The human resistance fighters, once terrified of being wiped out, now stood tall. Victory had been theirs, but it didn't feel like a simple win. It felt like the start of something new. Commander Darius Hale sat near a makeshift campfire, staring up at the night sky. The stars above were vast and countless, but his thoughts kept drifting to one in particular, Queen Vyrexia. He hadn't seen her since the duel, but her words, her unexpected respect, lingered in his mind. She called him an equal. To her people, that was unheard of. It was a title earned only by those deemed worthy, those who could not just match the Xetherian strength, but in spirit. And though they had stood on opposite sides of the battlefield, for a brief moment, he'd seen a glimmer of something beyond war in her golden eyes. The Queen's thoughts. Back aboard her flagship, Vyrexia sat in quiet contemplation. She had returned to her empire's central world, where the pressure to retaliate was relentless. Her generals, her advisors, her warriors, none of them understood why she hadn't simply crushed the humans. But Vyrexia wasn't interested in explaining herself. She had seen something on Kesar 4 that she hadn't seen in centuries. A challenge that could not be solved with brute force. Darius had shown her that survival was more than strength, that resilience was more than armor, and that leadership was more than dominance. The humans were unlike any species she had encountered. For the first time, she wasn't certain what the future held. And yet, that uncertainty didn't frighten her. It intrigued her. A new direction. The Xetheri Empire's focus began to shift. Phyrexia issued orders for her forces to withdraw from certain worlds, to consolidate their hold rather than expand recklessly. Instead of destroying weaker civilizations, she directed her scientists and scholars to study their potential. The humans remained at the center of her curiosity. Reports on their ingenuity, their adaptability, and their creativity began to shape new policies. A culture that had once known only conquest now began to consider something more complex. Coexistence. Phyrexia knew it wouldn't be easy. The Xetheri were proud, and change would come slowly. But she also knew that empires that refused to evolve eventually crumbled. And the humans, they were survivors. They would push forward, no matter what obstacles lay in their path. Unfinished business. As Darius watched the night sky, he wondered if he would ever cross paths with Phyrexia again. There was no guarantee of peace, no promise that the Xetheri wouldn't return one day. But for now, he allowed himself to hope. The war had changed him, just as it had changed her. Their story wasn't over. It was just beginning.